All right, welcome to the third video in our series looking at creating or generating prototypes for our digital solutions project. So in the previous video, we looked at starting to set up the interface for our solution by setting up our objects in Python. And what we're going to focus on today is actually adding interface elements into these objects using our Kivy file. So you can see in the app when we build it, we're loading in a file called screens.kv. So basically Kivy's going to take all that information and use it to build our screens. So we're going to flesh out our screens.kv file. When you've got nothing in there, you'll see it does hit up a problem. And basically it wants to know what version of Kivy you're using. So it gives you a hint down here. So it's just the hash colon Kivy followed by the version that you're using. So I'm using quite an old version. Most of you are probably using Kivy version 2 something or other. That's fine. This will all do the same stuff. You might even be able to do some cooler stuff than I can. All right, and you'll notice that problem goes away. So it's not a big problem. It'll actually work without that. But I know some people get a bit of anxiety when they see the one there. So just help you to alleviate that. So in our main Python file, just to recap, we have 3 screens that we're creating: login screen, task input, task output. So in order to define those, we use a less than greater than symbol, so it's sort of like a HTML tag, with the name followed by a colon. And so Kivy works on a very hierarchical style setup in the sense that as we add in elements to the screen, we indent to say what objects sit inside this other object. So I'm just going to give myself a little bit of room, but again, like what we always do with our structure, we like to add everything in before we start focusing on individual parts. So I'm just quickly creating the 3 screens at that base level, and then everything will be indented inside of these. So Control S is your friend. So with our screens, we're going to take advantage of a couple of more generic objects just to help with our set out in terms of the look and the arrangement of our other objects. So the first object we're going to use is a widget. So a widget is a very generic interface object, but the advantage of using this is it does actually help us position elements, size the elements, because it's itself a generic interface object within our screen object. And then within the widget, we're going to add in a grid layout object. So grid layout object, as the name sort of suggests, allows us to lay out our elements within this in a grid pattern. So with our grid layout, we do need to define the number of columns. So columns equals 2. So for our login screen, we're going to have 2 columns, one for the labels and then one for the text inputs that go with those labels. And so because we have them inside a widget, we can actually define their size and position of the grid layout. And so to start with, we're just going to say root.size, root.position. So what this is referring to, when we say the root object, so I guess the equivalent is in Python, we use self to say that, we're talking about the planner app object. So in Kivy, when we're talking about the login screen object, we use the keyword root because it is the root object, so the one at the top of the hierarchy. So all we're saying here is this takes on the size and position of the login screen, so it stretches out across the whole screen. It does do that by default, but it is useful to define that because we can use it to then create borders or those sorts of things later on. So once we've got our sort of key attributes set up for our grid layout object, we can go in and add the interface object. So the three main ones we're going to use as label, I'll come back to that later, text input, and then ultimately a button. So with our label, this is used generally, we can have two different types of labels. We can have a static label, which just has text and it's going to stay the same, or we can have a dynamic label, which allows us to change the text in it. So when we get to data output, we'll look at our dynamic labels. But for now, you'll notice I got rid of the ID because this is a static label. We just want this to say username, and that's all. Okay, with our text input that goes with that, we are going to give this an ID because we want to be able to interact with this object to get the text out of it. So the ID is customer. And the other attribute that we're going to add for our text input is the multi-line attribute. Reset that to false. So basically, we're only going to have one line of text for our customer. So before we do the button, I am going to create another label and text input combination. This one for the password. Password, again, static label, so that's okay. As is text input. So the ID for this one is password, multi-line, being false. Okay, so finally with our button, we want to add some text to it. So we want to log in, so we'll use login. And we want to create an attribute called onPress. So all we're going to do for this is we're going to see grid.pressed. So what this is suggesting is that when we press the button that's going to be created in our interface, we're going to go to our root object, so our login screen object, and look for a method called pressed. Okay, we haven't defined that method yet, so there will be a bit of an error. So if we go back into our main Python file, we can create that method called pressed. Again, we're going to refer to ourselves. Now at the moment, we're just going to pass. Because our main focus at the moment is just to make sure that our interface is up and running. Okay, so just to recap, we've got our widget, the grid layout within, two columns. So what we should see is label and text input side by side, the next label and next text input side by side, and then the button will be underneath the labels, will be shifted to the left. We can fix that in a minute, but we'll just check how we've gone. So remember, Control S to save. Run through the main Python file. You can't run through the screens.kv file. All right, and you can see we've got exactly what we were after. So username, password, text inputs, so you can put stuff in, and a button. Obviously, the button doesn't do anything yet because we haven't told it to do anything just yet. So in terms of the button, there's a couple of options about how we can get this centered. And so what we can do is, if we go back a level, so essentially what we've got here is one grid layout for the labels and the text input pairings. If we create another grid layout, and if if we set the columns equal to 1, what this will do is actually stretch the whole button out. So we can have a look at that just to see what that looks like. Then it has given us a little bit of an error. So the issue, what's happened there, is that if we go back to our screens.kv, we've said that we want this to take up the whole of the widget. So if we remove that, actually if we move that up a level, so what we'll do is we'll size the widget. Sorry, root position. That has not done the trick either. Might embarrass myself by showing that on the screen. Actually, I think I know what I've done wrong. So just go back a few steps. So I'm just going to tweak this a little bit. So set that to 1 column. And then this one, oops, is going to appear within there. So our main grid layout is going to have a singular column. And then we're going to have a grid layout with 2 columns, which is then going to house these objects. So just a little shortcut for VS Code users. If you highlight all of that text and then press the tab, it will indent all of that across. So you don't have to go to each line. That's really handy when you want to move a lot of things across at the same time and keep that hierarchy intact. So if we run this, this should give us what we're after. So there you go. So you can see with this one, what we end up creating is 2 grid layouts that are somewhat equal size. One inside of it has the 2 columns for the username and password, and then the button takes up all of that space. So I guess the other option, if we want to shrink that down, is we can use another grid layout in here for the button to be positioned. So we can quickly look at that. So grid layout, columns is 3. And so what we're doing here is we're just going to split it into a third. So I'm just going to add a blank label each side just to flesh it out. So you can see there's nothing in that label. I'll just indent those. And obviously add in another label. And so I've just got to close the previous instance so I can retest. You can see with that we now have a blank label each side and the login button in the middle. So there is other layout options such as box layout that you may wish to experiment with. I'm not going to go into all that for the purpose of this tutorial. It's really about that basic structure. So now that we've got our login set up, we can do something similar for the task inputs and outputs. So again, with our task input, we're going to have our widget, grid layout. Right. And so I'm going to use something similar to what we just had. Actually, just to save a bit of time, I know we talk about the idea of not copying and pasting, but we do want to push this video along a little bit. And particularly with our tasks, I believe we have 8 things we might, or 7 things we might want to enter. We don't need to add in the task ID, so that does save us a little bit. I just realised I called it customer instead of username. That's a bit silly of me. I might go back and fix that real quick. So been thinking about another project I was working on earlier today. Subject, subject. I'm sorry, that's what I want. So I just want to copy that label text input combination. Back that up a bit. So now we've done subject, so date entered. Well, actually, we don't need to put the date entered in, we can derive that. So the due date, the instructions. So because the instructions could be quite lengthy, I'm going to change the multi-line to true for that one. We can see how that looks. Instructions. So then we just need one more lot of copy and paste for the type. So that's obviously whether it's an assignment or just a homework task. And the time. So, the estimated amount of time it should take us to complete the project. All right, so with our button, we'll just quickly change it so it says add task. And we can use root.pressed again because the root object in this case is going to be task input. Okay, so we can save that. And obviously we'll just copy the pressed method, get that in there. Save as you go, Control S all the way. Control S this before too. Alright, so then with our task output, and again, because we've got a lot of these things, we might copy from the widget down. Again, like I said, I wouldn't recommend copying and pasting. If this is your first time doing it, obviously try to type all this out. But I suppose this isn't the first time I'm doing this. So the difference with our task output is we're going to take advantage of that dynamic label. All right, I'm going to keep the same IDs because again, it's referring to the title of the task output object, not the task input object. So by using these IDs, it allows us to tap into these labels and dynamically change the text value of them. Label. Two more to go. All right, so you can see for each one we've got a static label and a dynamic label. We don't have a button because this is, I guess, the end of the line for what we're looking at is to be able to display that task for the user. So again, we've got the widget, the grid layout, and then within that the other grid layout. I guess because we don't have the button, we could probably tidy this up a little bit by getting rid of that first grid layout. And then with everything, if we want to move it back a level, so currently you can see that we've got two indents from the widget to the grid layout, and that will spit an error. So if we say Shift and Tab, it will move back one layer. So now we've got the single indent and everything else moves with it. All right, so we've now got the structure for our login, our task input, and our task output. You'll see when we test it that we can still only access our login. So no matter what we do, nothing's going to happen. So in the next video, we'll look at starting to add the functionality to that button. So through the pressed method that we've defined.